Anyway, Ware Guild ordeal. Yeah, the book talks more about the ordeal on page 320. All right, we'll move on. The organization of the church. Now, folk about the church in medieval times, it was by far the most powerful institution that Europe had. The church somewhat kept Europe together, even though politically Europe was split up. The church got to where it performed your marriage ceremonies, issued the right to be married, could grant divorces, became extremely powerful and affected the daily lives of everybody. When Constantine first became a Christian, he divided the church up into bishoprics, one at Rome and one at Alexandria, one at Antioch and one at Jerusalem, and eventually one at Constantinople. Eventually the one at Rome, the Bishop of Rome, said, I am the head of all the others, of all the rest of you. Well, the bishops of Constantinople, the bishop of Antioch, the bishop of Alexandria, Jerusalem said, no, you're not, you're equal to the rest of us. This was to lead to a split in Christendom later. But the Pope claimed to be the head, and I found it most interesting when about, 21 months ago, the Catholic Church elected a new Pope, and the new Pope says, I don't want to forget that my first duty is I'm Bishop of Rome. And I thought maybe the popes had long ago forgot that they were Bishop of Rome originally and not head of the whole church. He said, I'm going to be Bishop of Rome. And anyway, originally he was Bishop of Rome. How did he become so? Well, that's a long story in itself. But as political power declined, the Pope was the one strong man of the hour. And this helped him out. Then, of course, when Pope Leo went out and persuaded Attila not to attack Rome, or made it look like he persuaded Attila not to attack Rome, this elevated his prestige. If you read a book about the papacy, and my brother-in-law has one that was written by a Catholic, you may notice that for the first 400 years, most of your popes were married. And a lot of times the Pope would hand his, the bishopric to his oldest son when he died. Father and son would succeed each other. Never a dynasty. You might have 2 generations back to back. But after 400, they decided that the Pope should be unmarried along with all the other bishops. Again, these doctrines we find in the Catholic Church today did not come about all at once. They were gradual developments. And you can read, there have been many books written about where the confessional started, where the idea of the Pope started, where that monks got started. Eventually, some people wanted to live apart from the rest of the world, and they became known as monks. Originally, a monk was one who lived alone, but then they decided they'd get together in one place. They called this place a monastery. So your monks would live in a monastery. Some women also got the same idea, but they were called nuns. And the nuns lived in a place called a convent. Now, these places eventually became places of learning. The monastery became the school, the hospital, the library, the civic center, all combined into one. The convent also became a place where the sick people were nursed back to health. The monks would go about helping poor people, doing some of the work that was needed in the community. A person who was too sick or too ill to work for his family, a monk might come and help him raise his garden or harvest his crop. They would do all kinds of good works in addition to devoting themselves to long prayers and a life of deprivation. The monks took 3 vows. Vowed 3 things: poverty, chastity, and obedience. Poverty meant I will never own anything except maybe the tunic I'll wear, one tunic, and that's it till it wears out. They would often sleep on wooden beds with wooden pillows. Extreme poverty, chastity. We will never marry, we'll never engage in any sexual activity. Obedience, we will always obey in the case of the monk, it was the father rector. In the case of the nun, it was the mother superior. We will always obey the person in authority over us. Three vows that they made: poverty, chastity, and obedience. I remember that because I missed it once on a test, a fill-in-the-blank test. I had gotten it right had I seen it on a multiple choice test. The fill-in-the-blank test bothered me, and that was the one and only time I ever made a C in a history course. This teacher would give fill-in-the-blank, and I was used to multiple choice. And maybe that's why I have such an affinity and liking for multiple choice questions. Because in those days, there were no Scantron machines to do your grading. The teachers had to grade it themselves. But anyway, leaving that, three things that monks vowed to do, among nuns: poverty, chastity, and obedience. And not that they always lived up to these. I mean, like everyone else, they sometimes had moral failures also. Among the church, they got to organize. The lowest class was the priest. And then above the priest was a bishop. Now the priest he was like the local parishioner. He lived in the community he served, and he would serve a community. In those days, of course, there were no automobiles, and a lot of people didn't have horses. So the local priest, the bigger cities would have several priests. One for this part of town, another for that part, another for that part. Over the priest were the bishops. And eventually, there came about the office of archbishop. He was over the bishops, and then finally cardinal, and then pope. There are now 5 ranks in the church: priest, bishop, archbishop, cardinal, and pope. But at this time, it was only priest and bishop, with a bishop of Rome claiming he was the head over all the other bishops. They founded, one of the founders of the first monasteries was Saint Benedict. Saint Benedict set up a monastic order, and your book gives his personal dates: 480 BC to 543. He lived over about 63 years. And he set the basic rules for monastic life that was followed by many people in the church later. And interestingly enough, the next to last pope called himself Benedict. 16 popes have named themselves after this man. The word Benedict also means goodbye. It's like benediction, or the service is over, somebody say the benediction, and everybody then goes in peace. All right. Leaving the church for the time, but believe me, we'll be coming back to it. The Carolingian dynasty eventually became weak, and folk, here's one theory as to why. The Carolingians believed that their blood was pure blood. Now, they didn't know about DNA or genes like we do, but they believed their blood was pure blood, and they even came to believe that they were descended from David and Solomon in the line of Jewish kings, and ultimately either descended from Jesus Christ or Jesus' brother James. And some historians actually believe that they might have been descended at least from Jesus' brother James. But they believed that their blood was pure blood, therefore they should not marry outside of their family, so they married their cousins. The result was they had a line of kings after Clovis. Clovis was the last of the Merovingian kings who really was strong and powerful. The rest of them became sickly and weak. So basically, here's a cycle. A king would be born to the Merovingian dynasty. He'd be the oldest son of his father. His father would live about 20 years and die, so this king would all of a sudden be crowned king maybe at the age of 4. It was his father had him when he was 16. 4 years later, the father was dead. So this king would grow up very weak and sickly himself because he was inbred. When he was about 15 or 16, they would marry him to some cousin of his. He'd have a son maybe when he was 16 or 17. He'd live about 2 or 3 years after his son was born. Then he too would die. And this went on for about 200 years or so. The Merovingian kings were very weak, very sickly. So the mayors of the palace took over. The mayors of the palace came from a family called the Carolingians. Well, finally, Pepin the Short wrote a letter to the Pope in Rome saying, this is a bad situation we have here in France. Our kings are do-nothing kings. They're mentally incompetent. They cannot lead. I think I should be king because, after all, my father and grandfather have been really they were mayors of the palace. But my father had been really the power behind the palace. You might call him prime minister. So finally, Pepin the Short wrote a letter to the Pope and said, I think I should be king. The Pope put his blessing on Pepin, and Pepin became the king. Now again, if you read conspiracy books, you'll find out that the Pope was scared of the Merovingians' claim to being descended from Jesus. And again, folk, I could spend the rest of the period, or maybe even next period, talking about that, but so we've got to skip over it for now. Just simply saying the Pope seems to have had something against the Merovingian dynasty after Clovis. So the Pope said to Pepin, you are the king. The people put Pepin on one of their shields and raised him up on their shoulders and carried him on his shield. Pepin became the king.